Welcome to Business Women Australia's radio show. I'm Sally Barker. Each week I'll be talking with a leading member of BWA. These inspiring business leaders are very generous in sharing their stories, insights and expertise with us. Joining me on the show today is Anne Hurley from HHG Legal Group. How are you, Anne?
I'm very well, thank you.
Now today we're talking about property law and what buyers and sellers need to know in the current market. Now the current WA market is, can we say, a bit of a shambles?
Oh, well, if you're being bullish, you'd say it's flat, but certainly it's very stagnant, absolutely. And so it's quite a difficult journey for buyers and sellers in the current market. I think they need quite a bit of assistance. And certainly when it's your major asset in your life, some people, this is the only transaction they ever do in their life, and it's a huge amount of money. Notwithstanding the market is quite stagnant, prices are amazing. If you look at when I first went into the market many years ago, it was very reasonable and certainly not in the hundreds of thousands and now in millions. So it's very difficult for people to get into the market, and the market itself is a tricky journey for people. So as a property lawyer, I act for buyers and sellers in different transactions, obviously, and they come to me with different needs and requirements, and I'm able to help them with that journey and make it as pain-free as possible, trying to outline to them what risks there are and how to somehow mitigate those risks. And sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes there are many risks, and you just, as long as you go with your eyes open and you've had some legal advice, accounting advice, sometimes financial advice, that's what's really important, I think, to West Australians, because property is the basis really of, most people's lives. Certainly West Australians, we love our land. And I come from a rural background. I grew up in the Swan Valley on a vineyard, and so land has always been part of my life.
Yes.
We've always had quite a few hectares, and I know it's, certainly on a social basis, stability comes with, ownership. And, in the current social environment, when you have a bit of stability, when you have ownership, when you have, some control over your future, I think that comes with, owning an asset that I think, it's all part of society at the moment. If you find it difficult to find accommodation, whether you own it or lease it, then, people are at risk, especially women, I think. Especially women of a certain age, it can be very risky. So,
and why is that?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? I think that some people have, been operating at a very high level and very high level jobs, perhaps overextended themselves, and with the current economic environment find themselves unemployed or with a lower salary and actually can't service the loans on their houses, and sometimes that ends up, badly. And so, in my experience, I've found sometimes women have the worst outcome, even educated women. So, we've got to, there's certainly a market there for women who need some assistance navigating that whole journey and trying to get themselves back into a position where they've got a stable life in the future.
We have spoken on previous episodes about our pride and our ego not wanting to admit that we are in a bit of trouble. Is this what is happening as well here?
I don't know. I don't find that particularly. It's like when you go to a doctor, there's no point in giving only half the symptoms because he's not going to be able to diagnose you. And so I find that when I meet my clients, I always, whereas we have email and everything else, my first touch point with a client is to meet them personally and understand their requirements, get a feel for their nature and their, risk, profile and how risk averse they are, so I can tailor my advice to them. And with that, I draw them out and I make them feel comfortable and I find that I end up with a good rapport with my clients, and they'll just, it's very confidential. We can't, as a lawyer, we're not allowed to release confidential information, and the information stops with me. So my clients can be confident that, even if they tell me the deepest, darkest secrets, it stays with me. Yeah.
So what's involved in a risk profile?
Well, I think if you're a vendor or a seller of property, I think one of the things that I recommend my clients do is, and this is a very jargonistic phrase, it's called due diligence. Work out when you're selling your property really what are the approvals, whether all your property is within the boundaries. Sometimes there's a survey doing. So you really analyse your property and work out, in fact, what it is you're selling. In this property market too, sellers will come to me and say, well, I'm not going to get the price I expected. My real estate agent has advised me that. However, I don't want to be in a position where I have to give warranties about the property. And so when vendors or sellers of land, residential land or even commercial land, come to me with that, I say to them, there is a possibility I can help you with drafting special conditions. So the usual warranties that are in land sale contracts, commercial building contracts, if they use the REWA forms, they can be varied. And so you can, in the market where the market is flat or the vendor or seller is not going to get the price he wants, he can tailor his contract rather than accept necessarily what the buyer is going to present to them. Tailor his contract so that the risks that he might see if he sells are mitigated. And also, sometimes we've got, in an ageing market, we've got a lot of sales of deceased estate properties. So I'm also advising executors and trustees about selling property and what are the risks, looking at doing a due diligence of the property, because they wouldn't have lived there, they wouldn't know much about the property as an executor, and trying and doing a special contract so that the risks aren't overlooked.
So what things would be included in a special contract that isn't on a usual document?
So we can use the standard REWA contract and the general conditions, and what we look at is perhaps if there's a survey of the property and fences aren't on the boundaries, we can deal with that in the special conditions. We can say there are no warranties, the property's taken as it is. The agent selling the property will say to the buyer, look, you're getting a very good property in this market with a very good price. And on that basis, the seller really doesn't want to warrant the usual warranties. And in Western Australia, it's caveat emptor, so the buyer has to be aware too. So a buyer will come to me and we'll do a due diligence for the buyer as well, when I'm not acting for the seller. And the buyer will have to satisfy itself about the property, because once settlement goes through, there are no claims against the seller unless something has been, there are problems with misrepresentations or whatever. So special conditions help, and we can tailor that to make it fit to the profile of the parties. We don't necessarily have to use a very complicated contract. We can draft a special annexure, and that tends to, make it more amenable to the parties. But covering, depending on who I'm acting for, covering buyer or seller, but not in the same transaction. So it's very interesting, the current market. Also, I'm finding with many strata apartments, there's in Perth, I'm sure listeners would agree with me, there's just many strata developments in Perth at the moment. And some of them, contracts were written up 4 or 5 years ago and construction has just been completed. So if I'm advising quite a few buyers who have been, waiting around for construction to complete, and what their rights are in respect of the apartments they're buying. It's very interesting so we've got caveat emptor, it means the buyer must beware, the buyer must do all its inquiries, and the buyer must rely on the results of its own investigations. The Strata Titles Act, interestingly in West Australia, reverses that a little bit, so that when there's changes, some material changes to the strata plan or the development, the Strata Titles Act sets it out more fully, the seller must keep the buyer aware of those things and have sent out notifications. So I'm finding a lot of buyers haven't necessarily been looked after by the seller, haven't been getting their notifications that are required under the Strata Titles Act. So the buyer feels sometimes that where it contracted to buy X, it's getting Y, and it's not getting what it thought it was getting when it signed the contract 4 years ago. So it's very interesting to give advice on that. And we're currently waiting for some amendments to the strata titles legislation, which will increase the obligation of the seller to give notification. It'll give it in a way that's, I feel, easier for the buyer to understand, because it is quite complicated at the moment.
So what sort of notifications are we talking about here?
Changes to the strata plan, moving the strata plan around, changing lots. It's got to be material. So the changes to the common property, changes to bylaws, which are often very important. The strata bylaws give rights and benefits and obligations to owners. So sometimes it's if it's a car park change, that's something that a buyer would have thought, well, that's very important to me at the time, having a number of car parks or the size of the car parks or the location. Some of those things are very material to buyers. And so it's very important that sellers give that continual notification where they're required to. And I also advise sellers, in that situation, they'll come to me and say, well, I'm going to change a few things. What's my obligations? What's the obligations under the Strata Titles Act? And we can help them through that and comply with their obligations, keep the buyer happy, and with an end result that construction's completed and everyone wants to settle their purchase. Yeah.
So what happens if there is a dispute and there is a buyer who doesn't want to settle?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There are a number of.
Because 4 or 5 years, that's quite a while to wait.
Yeah, absolutely. And the seller's been holding their deposit, and sometimes it's quite substantial. Well, then you have a situation where, under the Strata Titles Act, if it's a material notification and they haven't received it, the buyer can actually say, I'm not proceeding, and terminate
and get their deposit back.
Get the deposit back. And you can understand too that sellers are not very happy about that. And so, as you say, sometimes there is a dispute. And so we negotiate on behalf of the buyer. Sometimes it involves litigation. Sometimes sellers, understand the journey, understand that some buyers just, it's too difficult. And so, generally you have a group of sellers who do litigate, but then you have other sellers and buyers that actually work out a commercial outcome, and that's really good too. Because in this market, really, in my view anyway, a seller of apartments really doesn't want to be in the media for litigation and known to have litigated. So, and I find that most landowners, sellers, my clients certainly in the market, they're very commercial people. Very commercial people.
Yeah. So do your due diligence and make sure that you are, checking and checking and checking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
And for buyers, don't just set and forget.
Yeah.
Wait, don't just pay your deposit and get all excited, the emotion of the moment. Keep in contact with the seller, and if you feel that you're not getting notification of things, anecdotally things are changing, get some legal advice. Certainly, and that's, that can be easily done because it's a huge investment. And notwithstanding the prices, the market here is, upwards to $1 million as an entry point. So
yeah. Yeah, so it's an interesting market, our one here
It
in
is.
WA. Thank you so much for all that information, and thank you so much for joining us on Business Women Australia's radio show, Anne Hurley from HHG Legal Group, proud station sponsor.